How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 49th video of the channel, and today we're going to be beginning yet another series, which I've decided to call the Paper of the Month. Essentially, videos like these are going to focus on smaller works and essays, rather than whole books. For this episode, we'll be examining Melanie Klein's 1946 essay Notes on Some Schizoid Mechanisms, where she first introduced her concepts of the paranoid-schizoid position and projective identification. For anyone working through Deleuze Guattari's capitalism and schizophrenia duology, or logic of sense, Klein is essentially the main psychoanalyst they engage with. As such, I hope this video will be a bit helpful in putting their thought in context. All the sources I'll be using will be listed in the description below, along with a link to the essay itself. For a final little aside, please tell me if you think I should speak any faster or slower in the comments. I'm trying to find a good speed. Without further ado, let's get into it. Klein begins by giving some context as to the focus of the paper. Essentially, she found that many individuals experience anxieties similar to those of psychosis in early infancy, something that drives the ego, basically the psychoanalytic self, towards developing a specific set of ways to defend against them. In her words,
"These anxieties, mechanisms, and ego defenses have a profound influence on development in all its aspects, including the development of the ego, superego, and object relations."
In the context of psychoanalysis, objects essentially refer to people or their parts. For Klein, their relations exist from the very beginning of life, namely the relationship between the infant and the mother's breast. This undergoes a process of binary splitting, something I covered in a video I'll link in the description below. What this means is that it's divided into a good breast and a bad breast in the mind of a child, the one being gratifying and the other frustrating. Moving on, she adds that these two partial objects are then introjected and projected. What this means is that they are, on the one hand, internalized and identified with, and on the other, pushed out and onto other things. As you'll see later on, these processes are central to the building up of the ego and superego. For now though, her focus is still on giving some background as to what will be discussed in the paper proper. At this point, she turns her attention towards her work on what she came to call the paranoid position, an early stage of development where anxieties like those of being poisoned or devoured predominate, due to the fear of retribution for sadistic acts like biting the mother's breast, mirroring certain psychotic symptoms. In her original schema, this preceded what she describes as the depressive position, an important phase where children become capable of integrating loved and hated objects into one thing, as opposed to splitting them. In her eyes, any difficulties faced in the paranoid position, such as a particularly powerful persecutory anxiety, could impede its working through, and turn leading to a high risk for schizophrenia and other such psychoses. It's with this that we arrive at the first actual section of the paper, some notes on Fairbairn's recent papers. Here, she looks at the work of Scottish psychoanalyst Ronald Fairbairn, and some points of agreement and disagreement between them. In terms of the first, Klein relates,
He calls the earliest phase the schizoid position, and states that it forms part of normal development and is the basis for adult schizoid and schizophrenic illness.
With this, she agrees completely. It's the reason why the name for her first phase of development shifts to become the paranoid-schizoid position. Moreover, his contention that what counts as schizophrenia is broader than what's usually considered, for example in the case of things like what are today called general learning disabilities, is something she sees as quite important. However, Klein isn't too happy with all of his arguments. For example, she's strongly opposed to his denial of Freud's drive theory. Basically, while she and most other object relation theorists saw the dualism of the death and life drives as fundamental, Fairbairn essentially got rid of the idea of some internal motive for psychical activity entirely. Additionally, Klein is opposed to his claim that only the bad partial object, like the frustrating breast, gets introjected, instead viewing the good object as fundamental to the ego's development. All in all, as she puts it,
As a result of this approach, he does not give enough weight to the importance of early anxiety and conflict and their dynamic effects on development.
On this note, we get to the next section of the paper, some problems of the early ego. Klein's focus with this is to explore what she sees as the schizoid ego's tendency towards disintegrating and falling into bits. Giving some context, she first says that some of the elements that define the later ego can be found early on in an infant's life. In particular, she singles out the ways in which it defends against anxiety, which she considers as stemming from three main sources: those of the death drive, the trauma of being born, and the frustration of bodily needs. To tackle the first in particular, the death drive, what I'll call thanatos from now on, refers to the motive towards a return to the inorganic, something that manifests itself in the form of reckless, violent, and aggressive behavior. For Klein, Thanatos is an important figure in psychical life from the very beginning, and primarily takes the form of a fear of annihilation. This is felt by the young child as a feeling of persecution, being attached to frustrating and bad objects, which in turn gain an almost uncontrollable and overpowering status. However, even in spite of this externalization, introjection leads to these objects being incorporated and experienced as internal persecutors, making the fear of death even more overwhelming. No matter what, it's impossible to fully deal with the pressure exerted by Thanatos, therefore leading to a kind of falling into bits on the part of the ego, that she argues underlies later schizophrenia. Having now set some groundwork, we get to splitting processes in relation to the object. With this section, she explores how the ego defends itself against this disintegration, along with the role of splitting in more depth. To begin with though, she returns to the root of a binary split between good and bad breasts. In her eyes, Thanatos is first projected outwards through so-called oral-sadism, experienced as the biting we described earlier, as Klein puts it.
In states of frustration and anxiety, the oral sadistic and cannibalistic desires are reinforced, and then the infant feels that he has taken in the nipple and the breast in bits.
Here we can see that it's a bit more complicated than a nice even split between the two kinds of breast in fantasy. For Klein, the bad breast is seen to be fragmented by the baby, whilst the good breast, saved from the disintegration of oral sadism, is experienced as whole. With this, we get to the root of why she disagrees with Fairbairn on introjection. The wholeness of a good breast is critical for the preservation of the ego, helping stop its disintegration and splitting through incorporation. However, it's important to note that this isn't always the case. The division between good and bad partial objects can become a little murky when frustration and anxiety take hold. To borrow her words once again,
As a result, the division between the good and bad breast may be difficult to maintain, and the infant may feel that the good breast, too, is in bits.
Moreover, she explains that a split in an object is always accompanied by a split in the ego. What this means is that the more the object is experienced to be in bits, the less cohesive the ego is. Sadism prevailing leads to the ego itself dissolving, like discussed in the last section. Even if it all occurs in fantasy, as to say in the imagination of the infant, splitting is thus a very real thing, one that can have major implications for thought processes and object relations in general. With this, we get to the fifth section of Notes on Some Schizoid Mechanisms, descriptively titled Splitting in Connection with Introjection and Projection. Giving a quick rundown on the role of these latter two processes, Klein says that the first involves deflecting Thanatos onto, or rather into, external bad objects, whilst the second concerns the incorporation of good objects that act to protect the ego against anxiety. What Klein calls idealization is closely related to the latter, involving the good aspects of the gratifying breast being exaggerated as to create the idea of an ideal, always plentiful object that can defend the infant against a persecutory bad one. This occurs in tandem with other processes, like denial. Here the very existence of a bad breast is refused in a process akin to Freud's disavowal. In Klein's words,
The denial of psychic reality becomes possible only through the feeling of omnipotence, which is characteristic of the infantile mind.
Denial is not without consequence, however. Like we discussed earlier, a schism in an object is always linked to a similar process in the ego. Hence, the annihilation of a bad object results in a portion of the ego itself being denied. In this way, both denial and idealization are based in splitting, Klein adding that these, along with omnipotence more generally, play a formative role in delusions of paranoia and grandeur. Moving on, she notes that so far she's only discussed the oral side of persecutory fears. Nevertheless, there are other elements, like anal sadism, something that refers to aggression manifested through excrement. For Klein, the infant's fantasized attacks on the mother, whose body is experienced as an extension of her breast, play out in two main ways. The first involves trying to orally extract all the good parts, whilst the second involves expelling negative and harmful elements linked to the young ego. In the process, the mother becomes associated with the bad side of this ego. In Klein's eyes, this acts as a model for future aggressive object relations, as the hatred produced by Thanatos is deflected away and into those around the person in question. However, it would be a mistake to see these excrements as solely negative. As she puts it,
Excrements have the significance of gifts, and parts of the ego which, together with excrements, are expelled and projected into the other person represent the good. In other words, the loving parts of the self.
Along with aggressive ones, good object relations depend on projections like these. However, when deployed excessively, they can lead to a part of the ego being lost, and instead identify with the mother as the ego ideal, basically the perfect image that the ego strives to match. This impoverishes the child's self, and, since object relations inevitably expand beyond the mother, can cause what she calls an extreme dependence on external representations of the good parts of the ego. In this way, she states,
The processes of splitting off parts of the self and projecting them into objects are thus of vital importance for normal development, as well as for abnormal object relations.
We have to be careful, though, not to forget introjection. As we saw earlier, this is necessary to normal development. By introjecting the good breast, the ego is able to protect itself from falling apart into bits. In the process, however, the child has a tendency to idealize it, turning it into something it can run away to when feeling overwhelmed by the fear of persecutory bad objects. This can oftentimes prove dangerous to development. When persecutory anxieties become too powerful for too long a time, the ego can essentially become subservient to the ideal in question, turning it into what Klein describes as only a shell for the introjected good object. The end result is a cascade of splitting, with her saying,
Parts of the ego attempt to unite with the ideal object, while other parts strive to deal with the internal persecutors.
Nevertheless, states of disintegration are usually only transitory. It's here that we get to another interesting aspect of Klein's theory of development that distinguishes it from that of Freud and many other drive theorists. Basically, the paranoid-schizoid position under discussion here doesn't just occur once. Rather, individuals enter in and out of it throughout their lives, without any specific start and end dates. Getting back to the paper at hand, Klein argues that the ability for infants to handle going in and out of schizoid states points to them having a high degree of resilience and elasticity in their minds. However, this can only go so far. Eventually, if they occur for too long and too frequently, schizophrenia begins to take shape. In terms of depersonalization and disassociation in adult life, this is a direct result of a regression back to the infantile position. Taking a step back now to examine projection and introjection more generally, she says that normal development requires that they remain relatively balanced during the early stages of life. However, no matter what, they interact. If one dominates the other, that doesn't mean the loser just disappears. As Klein puts it,
For instance, the projection of a predominantly hostile inner world which is ruled by persecutory fears leads to the introjection, a taking back of a hostile external world.
Concluding the section, she summarizes what we've looked at thus far as the weakening of the ego due to excessive splitting, and, introducing a term that will become fundamental to much of the object relation school of psychoanalysis, projective identification. In this state of weakness, the ego is unable to integrate its internal objects, something that leads to the feeling of being ruled by them. In Klein's eyes, it's this that leads to certain forms of schizophrenia. Now, on this note, we arrive at schizoid object relations, where our focus lies squarely on how those in a position deal with things like interpersonal relationships. To begin with the basics, the schizoid personality makes use of projective identification to split off things like guilt from the ego and redistribute it to other people. This turns them into persecutors, hence things like paranoid delusions. Moving on, Klein, like for himself, sees narcissism as a defining characteristic of schizoid object relations in general. As we discussed, those in a position can turn external individuals into ego ideals. These are then loved, not for their own merits, but rather for the way they embody the good parts of a self. The same thing, but inverted, can also be observed. Those with schizoid personalities sometimes hate others because they represent what they see as bad in themselves. In this way, Klein seems to suggest a relationship between the position and obsessional neurosis, a condition roughly similar to that of OCD. However, she doesn't go into much detail here, instead simply stating,
These factors may lead to a compulsive tie to certain objects, or to a shrinking from people in order to prevent both a destructive intrusion into them and the danger of retaliation by them.
To end off this section of her paper, she states that schizoid elements often occur in otherwise healthy individuals. All of us, Klein says, are liable to moments where it seems like thoughts and situations are split from each other. In other words, to states where the ego undergoes a temporary schiz. Here, we get to section 7, the depressive position in relation to the schizoid position. As the title suggests, this serves to analyze the different phases of development posited by Klein in tandem. To introduce what exactly the depressive position implies in some more detail than earlier, I think her own words will be best.
With the introjection of the complete object in about the second quarter of the first year, marked steps in integration are made. This implies important changes in the relation to objects.
Basically, the position implies the splits made in the schizoid position falling away. The loved and hated partial objects fuse together, something that provokes feelings ranging from guilt to mourning, as it is no longer possible to hide from ambivalence. Sadistically attacking the bad breast impacts the good breast. The child can no longer keep the two apart. Nevertheless, this is incredibly important for healthy development. The depressive position allows infants to synthesize the fragmented parts of their ego, integrating them into wholes. Even though certain schizoid anxieties and mechanisms remain for the second half of the first year, these are less forceful and exist in a modified, weaker form. To take directly from the text once again.
In the course of this process, anxieties lose in strength. Objects become both less idealized and less terrifying, and the ego becomes more unified.
However, there are certain cases where this can't take place, namely when the child can't first work through the paranoid-schizoid position for whatever reason. Faced with depressive fears, a violent cycle forms where the ego regresses back and reinforces persecutory anxieties. This sets the groundwork for many forms of schizophrenia as discussed earlier, the disintegration of the ego becoming much more severe. Even when this doesn't occur, the infant is still negatively affected, the other outcome being the strengthening of depressive features. To demonstrate this, Klein relates the case of a child who, in spite of originally developing normally, regressed back to the schizoid position when he was forced to wean at 4 months old as a result of his mother falling ill. When she got better, gone was the young boy who was fascinated by surroundings and eager for food. Instead, she found a child to be completely apathetic. In Klein's view of the case, he had in fact entered the depressive position. However, he was unable to work through it due to the sudden loss of the object that was in the process of being integrated. He had already at this point introjected the good object, but was missing the whole one, as a result in his adult life.
A characteristic feature of his personality was the desire to love people, to regain and build up again the good and complete breast which he had once possessed and lost.
It's with this that she ends section 7 and begins section 8, connection between schizoid and manic-depressive phenomena. Klein starts by explaining that there isn't any firm line between the depressive and paranoid schizoid positions. Instead, there's a gradual modification of defenses and anxieties that bleed from the one into the other. She identifies these interactions with both manic-depressive disorders and some kinds of schizophrenia, like what is now described as schizoaffective. Considering the former first, Klein discusses one of her patients who was diagnosed by multiple psychiatrists as manic-depressive. Treatment was slow-going, largely due to the fact that she didn't respond to Klein's interpretations, except with contempt, change only being apparent on the unconscious level. In our author's opinion, it was as if there was a split between a part of the patient's personality that was receptive to treatment and one that was opposed. In this way, there was a kind of overlap between schizoid and manic-depressive features, with mechanisms typical of the former occurring simultaneously with those of the latter. In a particularly vivid example, Klein relates that
there were, for instance, hours when the patient was deeply depressed. Tears were running down her cheeks, and yet she said, when I interpreted these emotions, that she did not feel them at all.
The patient would even go as far as to reproach herself for not having emotions, experiencing bouts of disorganized thoughts at the same time. A strange mixture of melancholic self-hatred and schizoid flattened affect and formal thought disorder. Although exploring the relationship between the two falls outside the scope of the paper at hand, Klein suggests that cases like these demonstrate that there is thus likely a close developmental connection between manic-depressive and schizophrenic disorders. Keeping this in mind, we reach the third to last section we'll be looking at today, titled Some Schizoid Defenses. As she begins,
it is generally agreed that schizoid patients are more difficult to analyze than manic-depressive types.
The reason why lies in symptoms like flat affect and the difficulties connected to the narcissism associated with schizoid personalities that we explored earlier on in this video. In Klein's eyes, this is due to the splitting of the ego. The schizoid individual is so estranged and far away that can give the analyst the impression that they simply don't care. The splitting of the ego makes it so their personality and emotions aren't available. She gives the example of another of her patients, who, when his anger towards those more successful than him was interpreted as a desire to destroy her, concurred, but in an expressionless voice whirls away from the frustration that he originally expressed. Klein in turn interpreted this as a schizoid way of dealing with the fear of losing her. Instead of feeling guilt like someone fixated in the depressive position would, he split the parts of his ego that he felt were hostile to the analyst. As interpretations on the cause of splitting continued and were refined, the patient eventually became emotional and stated that he felt like crying. In this way, Klein managed to essentially synthesize the bits and pieces of his ego to loosen the hold of schizoid mechanisms and allow depressive integration to take place. Even though she goes on to give some more examples, it's with this that I'd like to move on to the penultimate section we'll be dealing with today, keeping time in mind. Titled Latent Anxiety in Schizoid Patients, this deals with just that, Klein beginning by saying that
I have already referred to the lack of emotion which makes schizoid patients unresponsive. This goes together with an absence of anxiety. An important support for the analytic work is therefore lacking.
The reason why this poses a problem is because the release of anxiety plays an important role in keeping the patient in analysis, furthering their capacity to cooperate, in Klein's words. However, a lack of anxiety only exists on the surface. In fact, the sense of being disintegrated is itself the equivalent of the emotion in question. The schizoid patient essentially hides anxiety by dispersing it through splitting. As such, the analyst can bring it to the surface and dispel it through syntheses like the one described in the last section, giving us an insight into how schizophrenia might be treated psychoanalytically, a problem that has vexed the field since Freud gave up in On Narcissism. Here, we arrive at the very end of the paper, where Klein's focus is simply on summarizing what we discussed throughout this episode. To go point by point, she first explains how paranoia, produced by the fear of retribution for sadistic behaviors like biting the mother's breast, acts as the predominant anxiety in early infancy, or the fittingly named paranoid-schizoid position. This in turn is defined by a number of mechanisms and defenses, most notably splitting. Although also a part of normal development, these act to set the stage for schizophrenia late in life. Turning her attention now to projective identification, this functions through splitting off parts of the self and directing them to other objects and people. Finally, as she says,
The onset of the depressive position is the juncture at which by regression schizoid mechanisms may be reinforced.
Now, with this we finish Notes on Some Schizoid Mechanisms by Melanie Klein, better understanding some of the intricacies of a paranoid schizoid position and splitting. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something, and if you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments so I can do better. Next time, we'll be doing a video recapping this week's shorts. Until then, bye!